Welcome to Issues That Matter. My guest today is Howie Hawkins. He was the Green Party presidential candidate in 2020, and he's here to talk about the situation with Ukraine and Russia. So, Howie, it's pretty ominous, don't you think?
Yeah, this is biggest crisis since I think the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of world peace.
So, can you give us a little background from your perspective on, how all this started?
Well, you can go back a long time. I mean, Ukraine has been struggling against Russian oppression going back to the czars during the Soviet period and now during the Russian Federation period. In when the Soviet Union fell apart, uh, Secretary of State Baker told uh, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, but it has since grown from 12 to 30 nations right up against Russia's border. So Putin has expressed concerns about that, demanded that Ukraine not become part of NATO. And even if it wasn't Putin, who is a autocratic, capitalistic, right winger, if it was a left wing government, they would, have the same concerns. What we could have done back then and was on the table was to develop security arrangements that included Russia rather than, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, NATO could have dissolved, and we could have formed something that included everybody for collective security. But in that time, the US felt it was the sole superpower and it could do whatever the hell it wanted. And it did. It expanded NATO, went to war in Yugoslavia and then Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and so forth. So that's part of the background too. That contributed, and then more recently, the response of the U.S. and NATO to the Russian demands that Ukraine be militarily neutral were rejected out of hand. But I don't think that's any excuse for the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian military. That is, naked aggression. It's all great Russian chauvinistic imperialism. You listen to Putin's speech beginning of last week, and he talked more about how the Ukrainians are like confused Russians. They're really Russians. They don't have a national identity. He blamed that on Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who supported the right of nations to self-determination. So he seems to have an imperial agenda as well as legitimate security concerns. So I think, what we should be demanding is Russian troops out and no to NATO expansion.
That's easier said than done. It seems as though, from what I've seen and from what I've read, Putin feels as if he's got his back against the wall because of NATO, eh, um, the NATO growing bigger and bigger. Would you agree that he feels threatened by NATO?
I agree he feels threatened, but why pick on the Ukrainians? This beef with his NATO, and he's invading this country to take it over. That's not an excuse. That has to
Okay.
be rejected and condemned. And we have to be in solidarity with the people in the Ukraine and many Russians. I mean, uh, there was, hardly any protest in Russia when they annexed Crimea. Now you've had, so far as of yesterday, 6,000 Russians who've gone out to protest the war. And of course, they can't do that legally in Russia, and they get snatched and thrown in jail.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be in solidarity with those people as well as the Ukrainians who are resisting the invasion.
Now, there's a young fellow who is uh, deciding to run for Congress, and he thinks that Putin is using this as a pretext using Ukraine as a pretext to say to start conflicts. What do you think?
Well, I think his ambition, Putin's ambition, is to reconstitute the Russian Empire. I mean, he's got little pieces of Moldova and Georgia, Chechnya. They killed the city of Grozny, just smashed it to keep them from being independent. So I think that's part of his imperial ambitions. Um, so I don't know if Ukraine is a pretext. It's like the biggest thing that Putin has done so far. But other people say, well, then he's going to go off into Poland, eventually Western Europe. I don't think that's his ambition. I think it's the old Russian Empire. He wants the old Russian Empire to be, one of the big powers in the world.
So, when you were running for president in 2020, did you see this coming? Was this ever an issue for you?
Ukraine never came up, never was asked any questions about it. I did talk to an Eastern European journalist who wanted to know my position on the Russian annexation of parts of Georgia and Moldova. But he was an East European. The American media, to the extent I was able to talk to them, never brought it up. I did call at that time for the US to initiate and go to Russia to talk about replacing NATO with other security arrangements that included Russia, and initiating nuclear disarmament negotiations, starting with the treaties the US withdrew from, Open Skies and Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, but with the goal of going all the way to the new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which 86 nations have ratified, none of them nuclear. I mean, if we want peace in the world and we want the US to play a constructive role, it should be convening the nuclear powers for mutual nuclear disarmament.
So, let's say lightning struck and you won the presidency. What would you do right now?
I would go to Putin and say, we're ready to talk about an agreement that would enable Ukraine to be independent, its territorial integrity in place, and it'd be militarily neutral, not part of NATO, not part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is the Russian counterpart now,
Hmm.
so that Ukraine would not be a security concern for Russia. I think that's the first thing I would do, as well as demand that Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine.
How big is the Russian equivalent to NATO? How big is it?
It's much smaller, and it's
Okay.
nations. It's mostly those southern Muslim nations, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan,
Okay.
um, and at one point it had 9 countries, but 3 withdrew, including Georgia.
Okay.
So it's NATO is much stronger militarily.
Oh, sure. NATO's been in operation for a number of years, right?
Yeah, the late 1940s, and
Okay.
the you add up the military budgets of NATO and compare it to the military budgets of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and the NATO is many times greater in terms of its military capabilities.
Now they're portraying Zelinsky on TV as a saint, a hero, somebody who's got the backbone to stand up to Russia. What's your opinion of Zelensky?
I think it's true. He's been, brave and a good leader for his people in this conflict. Politically, he's I guess, sort of a neoliberal, pro-capitalist politician. He, even before he became president, had his earnings. He was a TV actor who was acting. He was a teacher who accidentally became president,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of life imitated art. And now he's the president. But with the money he made with that, he had it stashed overseas. We know that from the Panama Papers. And we know from what was the second one was the Paradise Papers. The first was the Panama Papers,
Mm-hmm.
which has a lot of evidence that Putin has stashed his money overseas as well. So these, both Russia and the Ukraine, are dominated by oligarchs who took the state property of the former Soviet Union and became billionaires. The elections in the Ukraine are more open and democratic than they are in Russia. And, Zelinsky was elected in an election by all accounts was fair, not fraudulent, as opposed to Putin. And, just recently they had the parliamentary elections for the Duma, their equivalent of Congress in Russia. And there were left-wing candidates who were leading when they counted votes on election day, and then they counted the electronic votes. And, some of these elections flipped by 10% or more. So a lot of people say that was evidence of, fraud. They just wouldn't let these independent socialists into the Duma.
So, in other words, Putin considers uh, the Ukraine as part of Russia, and the Ukraine considers it not part of Russia. Is that right? Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, that's from what he had a 7,000 word essay last July, which was still on the Kremlin website the last time I looked at it, that
Mm-hmm.
basically said that Ukraine was really part of Russia. The Ukrainians were really, Russian, Slavic brothers, and they really belonged to the same country. He denied Ukrainian nationality and statehood. And his speech, what was it now, about a week ago Monday, said the same thing right before they launched the invasion.
Now, how long do you think this conflict will go on the way it is right now?
I'm afraid it's going to be a long conflict. I think the Russian military is just so overwhelming that they're eventually going to be able to take over Kyiv, install, a puppet government. But the Ukrainians will resist, in an insurgency. And it could go on a long time unless, NATO and the US, put Putin on the spot by saying, okay, let's allow for Ukraine to be neutral. And I've seen some indications that even Zelensky is willing to entertain that as a solution to this war. So maybe they can negotiate. The reports we're getting is, this big column, 40 miles long of, Russian troops and armor is stuck, and they're running out of gas. And that's either a result of sabotage by the troops. That's been suggested. People are punching holes in the gas tanks so they don't have to go to war, or they just did a poor job of planning the logistics. And maybe it's a combination.
Uh, as we record this, Biden is going to do his State of the Union speech tonight. If you were grading him, what grade would you give Biden in handling the Ukraine crisis?
Uh, Basically, I think about a D.
Really?
Yeah, when their response to Putin's demands about NATO not expanding and implementing the Minsk agreements for Ukraine, which would have respected the territorial integrity of Ukraine, would have allowed for a federalized system where the Russian speakers in the eastern provinces would have some autonomy, and would have withdrawn the Russian, military, special forces, and mercenaries. The U.S. should have taken them up on that seriously instead of saying, no, that's off the table. That contributed to the situation we're in. And so I think it was not a proactive peace policy that Biden took. It basically gave Putin cause for war, even though I wouldn't say it's at all justified. Um, that's what Putin says. My back is against the wall. I got to take over Ukraine to defend Russia.
Do you think that Putin did this because they consider Biden a weak president?
No,
You don't. You
no.
think this could have been done with any president?
Um, yeah, I think so. Certainly Trump. Trump would have probably said, okay, you can have it. Like, you know, Obama said, okay, you can have Crimea. We're not going to go to war over it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think Putin, wanted Ukraine all along. That's the big prize for him in terms of his ambitions for reconstituting the Russian Empire.
So the Western allies and NATO is going to fight this tooth and nail. And I look at it from two perspectives. God forbid a nuclear war, which I pray that doesn't happen. And the other scenario is a war with technology where we bring down the technology in Russia and Russia brings down the technology here. Do you think that's a scenario that might happen?
I think they're both possible. It's hard to put a percentage on it. It's mutual assured destruction, whether it's nuclear or cyber.
Okay.
Um, and then, mutual assured destruction as a doctrine of deterrence assumes everybody is rational actors and they're not going to start
Right.
something that ends the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Biden's rational in that sense. I hope Putin is. Although look what he's done in terms of his own objectives, what this war has got him. He's unified NATO like it hasn't been unified in, not just Trump time, but in decades. He's unified Ukrainians against the Russian invasion, all the reporting, except we can't get it from the two so-called People's Republics. Our journalists can't get in there, but in the rest of the country, the Russian speakers are as mad about this as the Ukrainian speakers. So he's united Ukraine against him. So it was not a smart move. I didn't think he would do it because it would be stupid. And of course, the sanctions against his economy are going to be really bad. I mean, the ruble has crashed. People have lost their savings. And then, getting, basic things like semiconductors. They're not getting that from the West. They, in time, may be able to, get it from China. Taiwan has said we're not selling you any now. And most of world public opinion, as we saw in the United Nations General Assembly, is adamantly opposed to what Putin did. Today, when the Russian member of the Human Rights Council of the UN spoke, most of the delegates walked out on him. So I think it was Lavrov actually speaking for, he's the foreign minister. So Putin has isolated himself, wrecked his economy, united the people he was worried about stronger against him. So, it seems like a stupid war to get involved in if your real concern is NATO's threat to Russia.
There's a growing anti-war movement in Russia. Do you think that will have an effect where Putin realizes he's got to back off? Or do you think he's going to come down hard on the dissidents?
Well, he wants to come down hard. The question is whether, his state and the oligarchs that back it are going to go along with him. Because a lot of them are getting hit hard. We've seen statements from children of oligarchs against the war. They're getting hit hard. Their wealth is, declined because of the collapse of the ruble. So, you could conceive of a scenario where the establishment inside the Russian state says we've had enough of Putin, and you have a palace coup. But on the other hand, the reports are that Putin has been, an isolated uh, ruler with only yes men around him rather than advisors who he listens to. And that means, I guess it would really be up to the generals in the Russian military to say, we don't want this war in Ukraine, and Putin has led us down into a disaster, so he's got to go. I think that's a possible scenario as well, but it's hard to estimate. I don't have a good estimate as to how likely that is.
So the price of gasoline since this started has increased. How high do you think it's going to go? And that could break the backs of the American worker. What do you think?
Yeah, this war is going to hurt the world economy. It's going to make inflation worse. And then, the establishments on both sides of this conflict are going to make the working people pay with austerity, higher taxes, lower social services. What we really should be demanding on our side is a crash program of heat pumps and renewable energy so that we're not dependent on Russian gas, and particularly in Europe, gas and oil. And we could scale that up like we did during World War II to arm the Allies. Biden could invoke the Defense Production Act to make sure our manufacturers produce those things. Bill McKibben of 350.org suggested that in an essay this week called Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom. I think, that's something we should be demanding. But I'm afraid what we're going to get and what we're hearing is forget renewable energy, don't worry about the climate. We got to up the production of oil and gas to replace Russian oil and gas with American oil and gas in Europe. And although this is, I don't think, the major cause of the crisis, this is also a war about oil and gas. Ukraine wants the transit fees it gets for the pipelines going from Russia to Europe. Russia wants to bypass that and punish Ukraine with Nord Stream 2, which Germany has now said they're not going to approve. And so the US wants to step in and sell its oil and gas. So everybody's got an oil and gas angle on this thing.
So if this is a prolonged war, do you think that there'll be a call for more fracking in this country?
Yeah, that's how we produce oil and gas. We
Okay.
do know the gas frackers have been holding back production to raise the price of gas. And they may get job-owned or stronger regulations to get them to increase production so we can get more liquefied nitrogen gas exported to Europe. We'll see how that goes. I mean, one thing we do know, despite all the talk about Build Back Better with a climate component, Biden has approved at a faster rate and more oil and gas drilling than Trump did. So, that's another thing. This war not only hurts, progressive social priorities and spending, public budgets, for social and environmental protections rather than more for the military. We may be going the opposite direction because of this war. And then actions to deal with the climate crisis are going to be put on the back burner. And that is, an existential problem for us, and we're not addressing it.
So, I've talked about um, Biden, the president. What's Congress been doing to alleviate problems with the Ukraine war?
Well, they pretty much echo Biden in calling for, the big thing lately has been stronger sanctions against Russia. And then, the Republicans, when they're not supporting Putin, as some of them were, are you're saying Biden was weak. And so Putin saw his chance. So it's, militaristic rhetoric from both sides of the aisle. which is, just bad for progressive politics, whether we're talking about domestic social priorities or dealing with the climate crisis.
Now, do you think because of the this crisis we're in right now with Russia, do you think next time there's a presidential election that the journalists will consider talking to the Green Party candidate, or do you think it'll still be the same way as it was in 2020?
Yeah, we were blanked out, and I think it's getting worse because the Republican Party is even more extremist than it was under Trump. Most of them are still saying that, Biden's election was illegitimate, and they are tolerating the repression of voting in the states. They are setting it up to control the election administration so they can steal elections. And on the Democratic side, they've not been able to lift the filibuster to get voting rights and election protection legislation passed. But despite that, most progressive minded people are going to think, well, we got to vote for the Democrats to stop these extremist, racist, neo-fascist Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
which is going to make it hard for the Greens to get a word in edgewise. And the corporate media, as well as even most of the independent progressive media, they're going to follow that line. They're just not going to, it's going to be harder for the Greens than ever in a presidential election. I think to get our foot in the political door, we got to do two things. One is run more successful local campaigns, for municipal office, county office, and from there, state legislatures and the House of Representatives. And then we got to fight to change the electoral system so that it's proportional representation in legislative bodies and ranked choice voting for executive offices. That takes the spoiler effect off the table and enables people who support the Green program to vote for it without worrying about helping the Republicans.
Do you see that happening as of right now?
We've been making great progress on ranked choice voting for single seat offices, and a little progress on setting up proportional representation through ranked choice voting for multi-seat districts. We've made more progress since the 2020 election, or in the 2020 election, where it was on the ballot in a number of places, and since then we have since the height of the progressive era, and even actually faster than we did then, when they did get proportional representation through multi-seat ranked choice voting in 20 or 30 major cities. So yeah, I think we can make progress on that. We do know people are dissatisfied with the two major parties, and as they understand these reforms, they support them. So I think there's real possibilities there.
So, do you think that the Democrats in the House of Representatives will close ranks and keep trying to keep you guys out?
Well, the House hasn't really been challenged by us.
Okay.
There is a bill for proportional representation in the House, but it's only got 7 sponsors. Some are more mainstream Democrats, some are progressive Democrats, but for example, the Squad, the left wing of the Democratic Party,
Hmm.
none of them are on that bill. They don't sponsor it. Fair ballot access is another thing. There hasn't been a bill for a federal standard for fair ballot access in federal elections since John Conyers put in a bill in 1989.
Mm.
And then you get a lot of rhetoric about, yeah, we need to replace the Electoral College and have a national popular vote. And of course, the Greens say that should be a ranked choice national popular vote. And there's some bills to set up a national popular vote, but they don't have much support or much energy. So it's not so much where we get blocked is at the state level. Here in New York, Andrew Cuomo rammed through a bill when we were locked down under COVID that tripled the signature and voting requirements for the Green Party to be on the ballot. They've made it harder in a new bill in Nevada. And there are other legislation pending around the country that will make it harder for the Greens and other third parties to just get on the ballot. And it's as hard to get on a ballot here as it is in Putin's Russia, you
Mm.
know,
Wow.
where it's a little different. Their petitioning requirements are high, but if you are a recognized party, you can just nominate your candidates internally.
Mm-hmm.
But they won't recognize and register parties. Like there's a Russian socialist movement that has, a base. They've met the requirements to be a party, but Putin's, minions won't, certify them as registered.
Mm.
So when I mentioned this election in September, the candidates they supported had to run on the Communist Party line. And there was a left wing of younger folks in the Communist Party that were opposed to the old guard, which are basically support Putin's policies. And they had a protest. Now, you can't do protests in the street, but if you're a member of the Duma, you can have a meeting. So they had an outside meeting. And that member of the Duma that sponsored that meeting, a few weeks later, was caught with a illegally hunted elk in the back of his car in the trunk. It's bizarre, but anyway, they use that to get rid of him. So the petitioning requirements, I could give you the numbers, I've looked them up, are very similar. In fact, just for example, if you want to run as an independent for the Duma, their Congress, you have to get 15,000 signatures in 45 days. It used to be in New York to run for governor and other statewide offices, you needed 15,000 signatures in 42 days,
Mm-hmm.
basically the same. Of course, now Cuomo and the Democrats tripled that to 45,000 signatures in 42 days, which is extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. So, as this crisis progresses, Howie, I'd like to have you back on issues that matter to talk about your understanding of the problem and what might be the solution. Would that be okay?
That would be okay. I'd be happy to.
Okay. So you've been listening to Howie Hawkins, who was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you, Howie. And
Thank you.
thank you, everybody, for listening.